undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Who next?
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, hope you guys are all doing well. Welcome back to my retrospective boxing series. So it's been a very long time since I did one of these. In fact, I think the last one I made was my Seth Mitchell video, which was well over a year at this point. And for those of you who have been following my channel for a while, as well as my live streams, you'll of course know that I've been talking about continuing the series for ages, and I've had many requests for fighters and situations to talk about. But with real life basically getting in the way, I just haven't had the time or the motivation to get round to it. As it happens, I've been working on a few projects for the channel lately, and I'm going to be getting back on track real soon, with more videos of this kind. As you can tell by the title, today we're going to be talking about a heavyweight champion who spent a very brief time at world level, but was generally considered to be one of the most dangerous and feared contenders for a while. The former WBC heavyweight champion Samuel Peter from Nigeria. So Samuel Peter turned professional in 2001 in the heavyweight division after a pretty decent amateur career, which included a run in the Olympics. Strangely, he had his pro debut in Kazakhstan, winning by a first round knockout. Shortly into his career he moved over to America and began campaigning there as a heavyweight prospect. He spent the early years of his career fighting on small hall shows across America, knocking out journeymen one after the other, and was developing a reputation as a devastating knockout puncher, with the vast majority of his fights ending in the first round. The first serious test of his career came in 2003 against the veteran journeyman Dale Crowe for the vacant WBC youth title. Peter passed with flying colours, winning by a fourth round knockout after a dominant performance. The following year, after a bunch of knockouts against journeymen, he took on former title challenger Charles Shufford in another major step up in class. Peter dominated the fight, winning by a wide unanimous decision, proving he had the stamina to go 10 rounds and to box tactfully when he needed to. He then took on the tough fringe contender Jovo Pudar, winning by a wide unanimous decision in another one-sided fight. Later that year he had the biggest fight of his career yet, taking on the tough fringe contender Jeremy Williams for the vacant NABF heavyweight title. In a surprising performance, Peter completely destroyed Williams, stopping him in 2 rounds. For the first defense of his title, he took on Yankee Diaz. In a pretty crazy brawl, Peter went on to score 5 knockdowns, winning by a 5th round stoppage. He was also deducted 2 points for hitting his opponent while on the ground. It was at this point that Peter began to develop a reputation as a bit of a dirty fighter, something that would be evident throughout his career. After an easy KO win against a journeyman, he got a domestic unification fight, taking on the NABA heavyweight champion and notorious spoiler Taurus Sykes. Peter won the fight easily by a 2nd round stoppage. After beating Sykes, Peter had a major step up in class, getting a world title eliminator, taking on the former heavyweight champion and future heavyweight legend Vladimir Klitschko. It proved to be a step too far. Peter was utterly dominated by Klitschko, being outboxed and outlanded in every single round, taking a beating in the process. Peter just couldn't deal with the jab or straight right hand from long range and was walking into punches all night, and it was a fight that really took a lot out of him. Interestingly, despite taking a beating, Peter also officially scored 3 knockdowns. However, 2 of them shouldn't have counted since they were from punches that blatantly landed behind the head. One of them late in the fight was a legit knockdown, but it was only really a flash knockdown. Nonetheless, Vladimir won the fight by a wide unanimous decision, giving Peter the first defeat of his career. After losing to Klitschko, Peter returned to the ring just a few months later and defended his North American title against the veteran journeyman Robert Hawkins, winning every single round and winning by a wide unanimous decision over 10 rounds. He then took on journeyman Julius Long, knocking him out in the first round. He then got another world title eliminator, this time for the WBC title, that was in the possession of the Russian champion Oleg Maskayev. as well as the lesser-known IBA heavyweight title, taking on boxing legend and multi-division world champion James Toney. The fight was relatively competitive in spots, with Toney's awkward style giving Peter problems, but for the most part Peter was in control, landing the harder, cleaner, more effective shots and outworking and outlanding Toney in most of the rounds. Peter won the fight by a split decision. After the fight, a lot of people called it a robbery, but me personally, I thought Peter won the fight very, very clearly, and I think that the Showtime commentators convinced people that Toney was winning when, in reality, he wasn't, but that's just my personal opinion. I gotta be honest, I don't even think the fight was close. The following year they had a rematch, and unlike the first fight that was competitive, the second fight wasn't even remotely competitive. Peter absolutely schooled and dominated Toney, knocking him down in the second round with a jab, landing more punches and winning pretty much every single round, and winning the fight by a wide unanimous decision. In my opinion, Peter could have actually stopped Toney if he wanted to, but he appeared to take it easy on him as the fight went on, and never really pushed for the stoppage. With the Moskaev fight being delayed, Toney got a shot at the vacant WBC interim title, taking on the tough fringe contender Jamil McCline. In what was a fantastic fight, Peter got off the canvas 3 times in the first few rounds, and very nearly got stopped, coming back in the mid-rounds, taking over the fight, winning by a close and competitive unanimous decision, in an absolutely incredible comeback, showing a huge heart in the process. It was at this point that Peter was starting to show signs of decline, however, and his punch resistance wasn't what it was prior to the Klitschko fight, and I think that was evident by what happened against McCline, but he still showed that he had the heart to fight through it. After beating McCline, Peter finally got a world title shot against the WBC champion Oleg Moskaev. Peter dominated the fight, stopping Moskaev in the 6th round, finally becoming world champion. Later that year, for his first and only title defence, Peter travelled over to Germany to take on his mandatory challenger, the former 2-time heavyweight champion Vitaly Klitschko, who was coming out of a 4-year retirement, getting an immediate title shot due to a technicality. In one of the most one-sided fights you will ever see, Vitaly dominated every single round, giving Peter a one-sided beating, and Peter looked a shadow of his former self, with his corner being forced to pull him out after the 8th round, giving Peter the second defeat of his career. This actually led to some calls for Peter to retire since he truly looked awful in the fight, and clearly he wasn't the same fighter anymore. The following year, Peter returned to America, taking on the tough contender Fast Eddie Chambers. The fight was close and competitive throughout, but Peter looked a shadow of his former self, being stunned several times by the relatively light-hitting Eddie Chambers, who, while fast and skilled, wasn't the biggest or the most powerful heavyweight. And you'd have imagined that a few years earlier Peter would have had a great chance of winning. Nonetheless, Eddie Chambers won by a close majority decision, giving Peter the 3rd defeat of his career. Later that year, Peter made a comeback, knocking out the veteran journeyman Marcus McGee in the 3rd round. After a couple more easy KO wins against journeyman, Peter got another title eliminator, taking on fringe contender Nagy Aguilera, destroying him, winning by a 2nd round stoppage. He then got a second world title shot, travelling back over to Germany for a rematch against the now IBF, WBO and IBO heavyweight champion Vladimir Klitschko. Just like the first fight, Peter was utterly schooled and dominated by Klitschko, losing every single round, and looking a shadow of his former self, being brutally knocked out in round 10, giving Peter the 4th defeat of his career. It seemed at this point that Peter might retire, since his losses to the Klitschkos were particularly brutal and one-sided, and it seemed very unlikely that Peter would ever reach world level again. The following year, Peter returned to Germany, getting a shot at the WBA and WBO Intercontinental titles, taking on the undefeated Finnish knockout artist and fringe contender Robert Helenius. Peter got off to a pretty good start, winning some of the early rounds and backing the younger Helenius up, making him move excessively. However, as the fight went on, Peter began to tire, and Helenius completely took over. In the closing rounds, Peter was once again completely dominated, looking a shadow of his former self. Interestingly, despite this, he landed a huge low blow that almost got him disqualified. And this only angered Hellenius. Peter ended up being brutally knocked out in round 9 after 2 knockdowns, giving Peter the 5th defeat of his career. This led to many calls for Peter to retire. The KO led to a long layoff. After retiring from boxing for over 3 years, Peter made a comeback in America, with a first round KO against a journeyman, Ron Aubrey, before retiring for another 2 years. He made another comeback in 2016, in Mexico, stopping a journeyman in the 3rd round. A couple of months later he travelled over to Bulgaria for a shot at the vacant WBA Intercontinental title, taking on fringe contender Kubrat Pulev. Peter looked in terrible shape, and was slower and more lethargic than ever before. Being utterly schooled and dominated by Pulev, Peter quit after the 3rd round, giving Peter the 6th defeat of his career. He then retired for another 2 years before attempting another comeback. After a first round KO win in Mexico, he took on the veteran journeyman Mario Heredia. Peter dropped Heredia in round 3, but went on to lose the fight by a close and competitive split decision, giving Peter the 7th defeat of his career. After another first round KO win in Mexico, Peter travelled over to Saudi Arabia to take on Hughie Fury. In a pretty ugly and messy fight, Hughie basically ran and spoiled, while Peter whacked him to the back of the head, leading to constant warnings from the referee. Peter actually landed some good shots and gave Hughie some problems, but his lack of stamina and poor overall conditioning was always going to catch up with him. Peter injured his arm during a clinch in round 7, and was controversially stopped, giving Peter the 8th defeat of his career. Later that year, Peter had his final fight to this date, travelling over to Canada to take on the undefeated knockout artist Arslanbek Makhmudov from Russia. Peter was brutally knocked out in the 1st round, and at the time of this recording hasn't fought since, and is generally considered to be retired. So yeah, that was the career of Samuel Peter, and I don't know about you guys, but I think he had a pretty interesting and riveting career as a heavyweight contender, despite only being champion for a very brief time. So how would Samuel Peter do in today's era, or any era besides his own? Let's talk about it. Me personally, I think Samuel Peter at his absolute prime, which I would say was right before he fought Vladimir Klitschko the first time, he had the 2 things that made him an absolute nightmare for any heavyweight, and that is of course size and power. He was a very, very big, heavy, strong man, and he had genuine power in both hands, being able to put you to sleep with one punch, and that was why he was so feared and avoided at that stage of his career. He was one of these guys who also, in my opinion, had slightly better defensive skills than he was given credit for. If you look at his fight with James Toney, for example, despite the fact that James Toney is considered to be a defensive genius and an elite level counterpuncher, and I'm bearing in mind that James Toney was many years past his prime, but it's besides the point here. If you look at that fight, Samuel Peter was quite creative with his offense, being able to completely and utterly deconstruct that Philly shell style, and his body punches were just very, very well set up in my opinion. He also showed a very good jab, and his lateral movement for a big lump was actually quite impressive. If you look at the second fight in particular, he was even able to get underneath James Toney's punches and land a few counters. I thought he looked pretty slick in there. He showed better boxing skills and better defensive instincts than he was often given credit for, so I do think that if he'd have had a trainer like Abel Sanchez, who he did train with for a time in his career, but if he'd have had a trainer like that early on, I think he would have developed into a very good, effective pressure fighter with great head movement, kind of like Mike Tyson, except a little bit more laboured, obviously without the athletic ability that Tyson had. And I think that gave Peter the potential to become a genuine, dominant heavyweight for a while. Unfortunately, he was a fighter who didn't really have the motivation to stay in shape, constantly blowing up in weight between fights, and even showing up to fights clearly having trained very little, if at all. You know, he had the Andy Ruiz, Jarrell Miller vibe about him. But I personally think that his size, strength, chin and power and overall durability would have made him a nightmare in today's heavyweight era. Like I said before, I don't think he was ever the same after the Vladimir Klitschko fight, and I think he had the misfortune of being at his peak during the Klitschko era, because in any other era this guy would have been an absolute nightmare. I think if he were around today, I would probably favour him over the likes of Anthony Joshua or Deontay Wilder. The only guys that I would be confidently picking over him are the more technically astute guys, the likes of Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury. You know, the guys who can box at long range for 12 rounds and have the stamina to move laterally. I think they would be too much for Peter. Although I would still give him a puncher's chance. Like, I actually think he hits a lot harder than a lot of the modern heavyweights. He just seems to have that real natural, compact build and really, really heavy hands naturally. So yeah, he was definitely a flawed fighter. Definitely a fighter who lacked athleticism and motivation. But I think he was technically very good. But he didn't always show it by not really training properly or preparing properly for fights. You know, he had multiple different trainers throughout his career and didn't really settle down with one that suited him, in my opinion. I really think it's a shame that he ended up with Abel Sanchez, training with Triple G and whatnot, so late in his career. I think early on he would have done a much better job. But like I said, I think he would still have been a very, very tough fight for any heavyweight of this era. And if you put him in an era of smaller heavyweights like the 60s, 70s and 80s, he would probably be a dominant champion. So yeah, that's pretty much how I see Samuel Peter. I think the guy was a very tough guy, very naturally talented, but never the most dedicated athlete, never the most intelligent. But what I will say about him is he has probably the most iconic and most memorable post-fight interview of all time. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed making this video. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you have any suggestions for situations or fighters to talk about for the retrospective series. I have a lot of videos coming to the channel soon. Thanks for watching and God bless.